Hi everybody, it's your friendly digital technology librarian, Christy, once again, and this week we are ready for yet another Film Rec Friday. This week we are going to focus in on some action-adventure titles, and as with every week, these are all going to come from our three video services that we offer. So, without any further ado, let's get started with some CleveNet Overdrive recommendations. So, this first rec is a little bit of an odd one. I don't know how many people are like me, but sometimes I really enjoy like those classic B movies, like the Ed Wood style. You can see the strings hanging, like the UFOs floating by kind of films. They're so bad, they're good. CleveNet Overdrive has one series that is probably the most infamous of the recent B movies, and those are the Sharknado films. Most people have probably at least heard about these, but for those who maybe haven't heard, Sharknado is about a freak weather circumstance where a really bad storm brings in, you guessed it, tornadoes filled with sharks, man-eating sharks that attack people. Stars Ian Ziering, so if you watched the original 90210, you definitely will know him. They're ridiculous, they're funny, they're terrible, but in the way that sometimes it's so bad it's good. They have absolutely ludicrous storylines. I mean, it's a tornado with sharks in it. I don't know how more ridiculous it could get, but it manages to do that scene after scene. And Overdrive has almost, I believe, all of the Sharknado films, so you can watch from beginning to end. And yes, that means there are multiple sequels to this. Again, not for everyone, but it is really, really bizarre and funny. So if you're just looking for something silly, strongly recommended that you check out the Sharknado films, if only so you can get the weird references that a lot of people pepper out there in conversation. So yes, Sharknado, recommended. My other recommendation for Overdrive this week is actually a really fantastically well done film. Absolutely not a so bad it's good movie. It's called 13 Assassins. Takashi Miike is the director, and it's actually a remake of a samurai film from the 1960s, and it's very loosely based on actual historical events. And when I say loosely, I mean like super loosely. But it involves a group of very, very skilled samurai who are essentially hired to take on this unscrupulous overlord who does horrible things to his community. But he, of course, with all this power, has a lot of fighting force behind him. So it's very well acted. It has a ton of really famous Japanese actors, and it has some incredible action scenes. So if you are a fan of like sword fighting movies, it is in Japanese, so you do have to deal with the subtitles. But I think even if you're not a fan of subs, it's well worth the watch because it's so amazing. Like the cinematography is just really, really good. And it's one of those movies that you really find yourself rooting for the good guys. It's kind of nice to have this sort of simplified good guys, bad guys conflict sometimes. And 13 Assassins definitely does that very, very well. You definitely know who to root for. The villain is definitely a villain. He's not an anti-hero in any way. He's somebody you hate the minute you see him on screen. So 13 Assassins, also on CleveNet Overdrive, very highly recommended for fans of action and sword fighting especially. So I have two recommendations coming to you from Hoopla. The first one is called The 13th Warrior. Nothing to do with 13 Assassins. Now, The 13th Warrior is actually a rather loose retelling of the Beowulf story. So you have your traditional like Viking Norse warriors going off to fight against a monster, essentially Grendel, and these Vikings are trying to protect this small Viking village, but there's also this weird mix-in of Antonio Banderas, who's been cast as a poet of Baghdad who's been exiled. It's kind of a weird way to throw in some other cultural norms, but it's still a really, really entertaining story. I've always been a big fan of Norse myth and mythology, and I love the Beowulf tale. So if you happen to like that sort of swashbuckling adventure, lots of battles, lots of gore, fighting against monsters kind of thing, definitely recommend The 13th Warrior. Plus, Antonio Banderas is always vaguely entertaining. He plays an odd character, but it is, again, a very entertaining film. So The 13th Warrior, check it out. And the other movie that's on Hoopla is called The Brothers Grimm. This, of course, follows two characters who happen to be based on the famous brothers who created all of the very, very famous fairy tales that we know, and they just happen to be played by Matt Damon and Heath Ledger, which is always a win. They end up, as they're collecting these folk tales and stories, they have to face off against a real evil queen. So you get, you know, your standard sort of fantasy interplay with action and some really, really fantastic production design. Some of the characters and the monsters and everything are really, really cool looking. So Brothers Grimm, also a really, really fantastic option if you're looking for a more fantasy-based action adventure. And that one is also on Hoopla. Okay, so my last recommendation this week is, as always, from Canopy, and it is actually for the movie The Italian Job. And this Italian Job is not the remake that they made in the mid-2000s. It was a pretty mediocre film with, I believe, Mark Wahlberg. This is the original, starring Michael Caine. It's well written, it's witty, it's funny, it's the perfect kind of heist or caper film. If you like stories like The Sting, Ocean's 11, definitely check out The Italian Job. It's got a phenomenal setting of Europe. It's a classic. I mean, there are iconic cars, all kinds of twists and turns. There's humor, there's action, there are traffic accidents, and there's tons and tons of gold. So if you do love caper films, I cannot recommend anything more than The Italian Job. It's really fantastic, and Michael Caine is always amazing, and he's particularly awesome in this. Very witty, and it's definitely a recommend on my list. The Italian Job, check it out on Canopy. And as always, please do offer up any recommendations that you might be having as far as things that you've been watching. Mention in the comments below. And again, as always, we miss you, and hopefully we'll see you soon. Have a good weekend.